flesh.
So we're taking a closer look at Job and his friends. And as you'll probably remember, you may have heard me say it in previous weeks, Job is part of a collection in our Old Testament, our books of the Old Testament that are called wisdom literature. Job sits along books like the Psalms, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Lamentations. And these books are an expression of the human experience with God. Pursuits of pleasure, depression, praise, grief, wise decisions, and as it relates to Job, friendship and suffering. One of the things I forgot to mention last week and the week before, I forgot to bring out that sometimes names give us an important cue as to what's going on with this person. And one of the things I wanted to tell you is that the name Job means the persecuted one, the oppressed. Isn't that interesting? Well, look, we're human beings. We are physical creatures, we are mental creatures, we are emotional creatures, we are spiritual creatures, but there's another thing we are. We're social creatures. You ever noticed how wired we are for relationship with one another? That's part of who we are. And I would say that's a good part of who we are. But sometimes things can go wrong. Sometimes things go wrong in this social sphere that we all share. And perhaps, well, maybe the friend of Job, Zophar, deals with that better than this. But there's some overlap here as well. This week, we're going to talk about Job's friend, Bildad, and I call him Bildad the callous judge. And I hope you'll understand why as we kind of go through some of his comments. Now, one thing I've probably mentioned that's probably worth repeating is all of Job's earthly friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and even someone we'll meet later in the book of Job, a young man by the name of Elihu, they all share a common belief. Are you ready for it? The common belief is this: if you were suffering, it's because you did something you weren't supposed to, and shame on you. And by contrast, if you were comfortable, if you were satisfied, if you were wealthy, then you must be doing what was right. And there really is this is a very polarized there really is no middle ground here. It's either one or the other. And so when calamity befalls Job, all of his friends make the same categorical error, which is Job's done something wrong. And they come and they gather and they fast and they pray and they throw dust on their heads and they tear their clothes, which is all expressions of guilt in this time and place. And if they just stayed silent, all would have been fine. But then they do the one thing that we humans just can't resist, because we're social creatures, right? We want to figure it out. We want to diagnose the problem, because that gives us control. So we talked about Eliphaz last week and how he's lifting up the values of religion. But and I forgot to mention this too. Eliphaz's name means God is fine gold. And he deeply values religion. And initially, he tried to encourage Job, but when Job challenged his belief, Eliphaz flipped the script. I mean, he really came unglued, and he turned on Job, and he began to accuse Job of committing the most vile sins in that place. We talked about some of that. Well, this week we're looking at Job's friend Bildad the callous judge. And Bildad's name means God brings the increase, or loved by God. If Eliphaz was an overly cheerful pastor, Bildad is a callous judge. He was intelligent, he was well-read, he valued justice and tradition. Instead of valuing religion, Bildad valued tradition and the lessons of their ancestors. You might have heard that verse in there, ask the former generation, find out what their ancestors learned. For we are born only yesterday and know nothing, and our days on earth are but a shadow. You know, this kind of put us in sort of a cosmic perspective. Bildad valued tradition and the lessons of their elders, their ancestors, but he was especially concerned with social order. Social order. Now, Bildad's first speech came after Job's first exchange with Eliphaz, and all three of Job's friends believe Job has offended God in some significant way. Eliphaz is the first one to say it out loud, but Job was having none of it. And as a result, Bildad didn't start off gradually like Eliphaz did last week. Eliphaz kind of had a nice initial, speech to Job. And then, his second and third speeches got, nastier and nastier. Bildad, there's no gradually about it. In chapter 8, verse 4, Bildad says, when your children sinned against, not if, when your children sinned against him, he, God, gave them over to the penalty of their sin. Now let's pause and remember, you're talking to a father that just lost 7 sons and 3 daughters instantly. Never mind the fact that he lost all his sheep, goats, camels, donkeys, and cattle. Never mind that he's afflicted with a terrible physical illness that's so painful that he's sitting in the dust, scratching his sores with jagged pottery. Never mind the fact that he's in an absolutely wretched condition and he can't even get a good night's sleep. You're talking to a father who's grieving the loss of his children, and the first thing you say is, when your children sinned, God killed them? That's literally what the man said. There's no pretense here. Now, by our cultural standards, this is bad grief counseling. Okay? More than that's probably understated. This is a traumatic, damaging thing to say to this man. Perhaps in their culture it might have been different. I'm not sure. What I do know is this. That was the first thing he said. He's not concerned with concerned with social custom. He's not concerned with, he's going straight to the point. So let's back up also and remember that Job is a man who sacrificed several times a year to God after his sons and daughters would have their feasts in order to atone for any sins that his children might have committed in the course of their feasting. Maybe a loose comment, maybe something they didn't really think out after they'd had a glass of wine or two, maybe something they might have said that would have offended God. Job was consistent. I won't say obsessive, but he was very committed to maintaining this relationship with God. And it is to that man, who's just lost all 10 of his kids, that Bildad says, when your kids sinned, God punished them. And he says you should go, and he says, God is always fair. You should go, you should confess to God. And he urged Job to go to God. And Job's rebuttal was to answer that God is not like human beings. God is not like a court of law. You can't go to a courthouse and sue God. Although I did see a play one time where somebody talked about that. That was the play. Someone was going to go sue God. It was kind of funny. But Job's standing here. He says, "You can't do that. You can't go sue God. God is not a mere mortal. I can't find him to please my cause. And even if I were innocent, if I were to stand in the presence of God and see God as God is, I would become so overwhelmed by everything that God is. God is so profound and so great. I'd lose myself. I'd lose my own sense of my own pain just in the shadow of God. God is so awe-inspiring. He says, my own mouth would condemn me. And then Job says something that I find very interesting as a pastor and a theologian. He says, if only there were someone to mediate between us. Someone to bring us together. Now, as a follower of Jesus, when I read this, I go, it's messianic. The Old Testament is talking about Jesus. The Old Testament is talking about someone who can stand in between fallen humanity and holy divinity and bring them together. Folks, that's what the incarnation's all about. That's what Jesus is all about. All of God, all of humanity in one being, fully God, fully human, fully divine. That's what Jesus is all about. That's classical Christian orthodoxy. That's what the church has taught for 2,000 years and counting. And if you don't get excited about it, stick around. Because we're going to talk about it a lot, especially Christmas. He says, if only there were someone to mediate. This is thousands of years before Jesus' birth. So Job and Bildad go back and forth, and Bildad's speeches grow shorter and shorter each time. But what caught my attention is Job's second speech. And Kim read it just a minute ago, where he describes in detail how he feels alone, how he feels abandoned by his closest friends, by his relatives, his wife, even the servants in his household and the kids on the street. He talks about how alone he feels, how abandoned he feels, how much his social status has tanked because of this. Everyone has turned against him. He feels utterly alone. And he basically says, God's done that too. God's done that too. So what do we do with all this? What do we do with Bildad? What do we do with Job? How do we understand this? How do we relate this to our own situation, our own lives? Well, excuse me. So was Bildad right or wrong to condemn Job's children? In our culture, certainly in bad taste. Certainly in bad taste. But sometimes it's also valid to speak uncomfortable truth. Sometimes we do have to do that. There's a whole industry built on speaking uncomfortable truth. They're called comedians. And were I to try such a profession, I would starve. My wife can tell you. Now, it's really easy. I don't know if any of y'all catch this on social media from time to time. There'll be a short video that'll come up with, I think it's Kira Sedgwick and Kevin Bacon, the guy who's been in everything. He strums a guitar and they sing something like, "We listen and we don't judge." Now, it's really easy to do that, okay? But let's also acknowledge that none of us want to live in in a world or in a society where the government does that, where the government says we listen and we don't judge. We need social order. We need social structures that correct and punish the guilty, and we also need social structures in place that preserve the innocent. And that's part of what Job was talking about. He's saying, look, he says, I'm not guilty. Bildad would say, yes, you are, and you're disrupting the entire social order. And Job says, no, I'm not. This isn't fair. This isn't right. So I was thinking about this, and I've been trying to figure out how this lands and how we should respond to this, how we should understand this, in our own circumstances. So here's what I've come up with. I think Bildad is one of these people, and I hope I'm using this phrase right, he missed the tree for the forest. I've heard the phrase, miss the forest for the trees. You're so focused on one thing that you're not seeing the big picture. Bildad's the opposite. He's so focused on the big picture, he doesn't see the person that's in front of him. And that's a problem. Have you ever been having a conversation with someone and all of a sudden they say something that's just completely off topic? Like I was having a conversation with a kid one time last year. I was really trying to get through to this kid because I was really frustrated with this kid's behavior. Some of the kids that I deal with had no problem just talking out in the middle of class while the teacher was instructing. And I was like, no, that's not working for me. And the response was something like, can I go to the bathroom? I'm sorry. That has nothing to do with our conversation here. I think that's what happened with Bildad here. He saw Job, he saw the suffering, and he went completely off topic. He said, well, your kid sinned. Doesn't have anything to do with what's going on with Job right here and right now. So, don't throw the hymnals at me when I say this, please. But one of the things I am tired of, one of the things I am so tired of, is I'm tired of people telling me that they will solve every problem in our country if I just vote their way. I'm tired of hearing it. It's not true. I'm done with it. We have come to a place where first of all, our country is very, very polarized, and I think the people to blame for that are the social media. I really, really do. It's ironic that we're sharing our service on social media, but I really do think that social media is a big part of that. But I think there's another problem, and that is a lot of us have sort of lulled into or we've just kind of gotten into, we revert to politics as a solution to something. And that's not the way to solve the problem. The way to solve problems that are in front of us is to get directly involved. It's not to wait until the next election day and vote this way or vote that way. That's not going to work. It's not to write a long Facebook post and say all of the things. It's not to turn Facebook into your journal, okay? It's not that. The way you fix a problem is you get involved. You get directly involved. You get person to person involved. And when you do that, oh goodness, you learn stuff. Maybe you find out things aren't the way you thought they were. Maybe you find out that somebody who told you it was one way was lying or trying to manipulate all of us. The most important thing that we ever give is ourselves to one another. And we don't have to agree on everything in order to do that. You know, if we might disagree on one thing or another. I don't care if you vote red or if you vote blue or if your household is purple. That means one of y'all votes one way and the rest of y'all vote another way or whatever. The most important thing that we give is ourselves. Always. And we don't have to agree to do that. We can just love one another. That's it. And I'll say this, and I'm probably meddling too, but if you follow Jesus long enough and close enough, you will go places you never expected. And that's not a bad thing. Because oftentimes the truth isn't black and white. Sometimes there's a lot of gray in there. Well, the cat's out of the bag when we start talking about politics and things like that. So I'm going to revert back to something that John Wesley once said about voting and about politics. He said three things. If you Google John Wesley's 3 things about politics, you'll find it. It's real easy. He says, vote for the candidate that you believe is most worthy. Vote for the person that you think is the best candidate. Number 2, this is important. Say nothing about other candidates. Don't say anything negative about anybody else. Don't know if you know this or not, but every time I took a whole poli-sci class, political science class on elections in the year 2000. You remember that? You remember that year? That year when George W. Bush and Al Gore were running against each other, and then that thing in Florida happened where people didn't know how they voted. Remember all that? Yeah. And then we had to think about, does the paper have to be pierced all the way through, or does a hanging Chad count, or does a dimpled Chad count? People were voting by ballot, and you were supposed to poke a stick through a piece of paper, and if it poked all the way through, I guess it counted, and if it didn't, I don't know. Anyway, statistically, the election should have gone one way. It actually went the other way. And part of the reason it went the other way is because there was genuine confusion about the ballot layout. That's the historian in me talking. But John Wesley said, vote for the candidate that you think is most worthy. Say nothing negative about the other candidates for whom you did not vote. And then this is the third one, and this is the one I think we all need to hear, and it's certainly the one I need to repeat for my own benefit. Are you ready? Third one is, do not be sharpened against anyone who voted differently from you. That's where I feel like the rubber meets the road on this. Okay? So, what can we learn from Bildad? Well, what we can learn from Bildad is focused on the big picture, and he's overlooking what's right in front of him. Sometimes we do that. I think there are a lot of people, I think there are a lot of things that are competing for our attention. There are a lot of things that are trying to get us to do one thing or another that helps them, doesn't help us. Helps them, doesn't help the people that we want it to help. And I think the only way to really rectify that or correct that is to get involved, to step in directly, to take myself, say, I don't know everything, but I'm going to go and I'm going to try to be the hands, feet, and heart of Jesus in that situation. And I'll bet if we do that, we'll make a much bigger, better impact than we will if we all keep playing in to the same cycle that we've been playing into for way too long. I'm going to say one last thing here on this. Let's make politicians poor again. Will you join me in a brief word of prayer? Lord, help us to be the house of God, to be the place where everybody's welcome, where everyone knows they're a child of God, where everyone knows they're loved, where everyone knows that they're supported, where everyone knows that someone will listen, and that we don't have to agree on everything in order to love one another in Jesus' name. Help us to lift one another up. Help us to get involved. And help us to bring our full selves and trust that you're going to do what needs to be done. And it's going to look like what you want it to look like. Not what we think it ought to look like. Or not even what we want it to look like. Because we're citizens in a kingdom. And heaven is not a democracy. And what really matters is what the king thinks. These things we ask in Jesus' name.